Good afternoon. This is Valerie Yance from Queens Conference Center. We're going to start this training today. Welcome everybody in the auditorium and online. We're very happy you're here today. We have an echo, right? Camille, you got, mute me over. Just take a minute here. Yes? Muted here. Got it? Okay, today's training is hear us? You are unmuted by the host, good. And we're here today as the last training of 2018. Just a minute, I'll be right back. Thank you. I love digital technology, and it is always there to challenge us and teach us how to communicate better. So let me get through some of these slides here. If I can get the, great. So the organizers of this year-long training have been myself, Camille Cristobal, and Christopher Hill, and Camille is actually here today. I'm here today. Christopher is in Japan, and this is all, the three of us, this is our last training, and I'm retiring at the end of this month, and Camille is moving to Nevada, and Christopher's already moved to Japan, and we have enjoyed doing this training series. And the good news is we have the Hawaii Public Health Institute, and there are several folks working as a team to take over the training series for Hawaii. We work in the Western region, and it includes Nevada, California, Pacific Islands, Arizona, and us, as you can see from this slide. And we have these sponsors and partners, so it has been, I have been through the University of Hawaii at the Office of Public Health Studies, and we've used the Public Health Learning Network, and then Queens Medical Center has been so generous to let us use this fabulous auditorium and the AV staff and sound system, so all of you can hear us and see us. And so we have been approved for all of these continuing ed in all 5 categories, and those of you who are in a certain category and you see the red writing, you know that you need that number when you submit for your continuing ed, or we submit your CHES numbers. These are the linking professional competencies. It's going to be a bit about management and organizational change and leadership throughout the slides. If you're requesting continuing ed, you do need to do the evaluation feedback survey, and Camille will be sending that out to you as soon as we end Zoom. And there, as you know, for those who are, and this is what the survey looks like, the email that should come to you, and you click on take the survey and you're good to go. And then we do have continuing ed with nursing. They ask that we use their slide, these 3 slides, including the learning objectives for today that Janelle will be going through, about best practices and the readiness for organizational change. And then she has not just 2 examples. I saw that she had actually 3 different examples. The planners and the presenters have no relevant financial relationships to disclose, and this is where you go if you're seeking CNEs for nursing. And it's 1.5 contact hours today, the 90 minutes. And when you go to that to that link, this is what the website looks like, and most of you have figured out where to click on the right-hand side for CNEs. For CHES, which is the Certified Health Education Specialist, you will need to take this extra survey at this link, because that's where you enter your CHES number, and we must report that for you to get credit. And when you go to that link, that's what the website looks like, and you take that short survey and you're good to go for CHES credits. We are using Zoom. We are become big fans of Zoom, and we also record what's going on, and we put it on the YouTube, and we'll be transferring the YouTube from my YouTube to the Hi-Fi YouTube, and we will be putting all of the copies of all of the trainings of this year on the YouTube, but we probably won't go back much farther than that. And then this is a relatively new slide from about 3 trainings. So the wonderful thing that the University of Arizona is the College of Public Health, that's what COPH means, is the central office for our Western region, and they have created a special training technology through the software called Moodle. It's Noodle with an M, and there are 2 links here. The first one is, if you click the first one, it'll take you to this page that you're seeing below, and if you click the second one, or type it, copy it and put it in your browser, it will let you log in and create a login one time, and then you can go in and access many, many enduring trainings. So we're trying to, if we do a training, we're trying to record it, and we've been putting it on the YouTube, but you can't really get credit. It's just credit for the live training. And now the University of Arizona is making the move that future trainings will have enduring credit. And so we're still working on that, but that's very good news for all of us in Hawaii, because pretty soon there will be quite a group of trainings listed here. Most of you already know that you were supposed to enter through this door. Queens is having their big holiday employment luncheon, and they did not want us to pass through the backside. And I've never been through the front door, so today was the first time for the front door entrance, and I enjoyed it. It's such a pretty building. And then Camille should have sent you the link for the online PowerPoint, and then you would have gotten what else? Oh, just the instructions for CNEs. And here today we have the evaluation for the people in the auditorium, and then you'll get your certificate at the end. And now to the good part for Janelle Sugimoto Matsuda. We have been colleagues and friends for a long time, and she works in 2 different UH of Hawaii departments, the Department of Psychiatry, which is where she runs her youth suicide program and grant, and she's quite active, as she will tell you more. And then she also works in my department, the Office of Public Health Studies. She is an amazing trainer and a wonderful educator. I have heard her do several presentations, and I knew that this will probably be my last training, and I was so happy that she agreed about a year ago to take the slot, even though we were just talking about how many student papers we have to grade, and grades are due on Tuesday, and UH mid-year graduation's tomorrow. But her, as you can see, her title, Change Management and Evaluation, is actually my title, and she was willing to use it. And I'd like to invite Janelle up here as our speaker today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining either here at Queen's Conference Center or over Zoom if you're joining us virtually. I know there are quite a few people online, so thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to be here at this training. So yes, about a year ago, Val asked me to come and talk about organizational change and change management. And I said, sure. And, you know, about 9 months, 10 months go by, and she says, oh yeah, don't forget, you're gonna do this training. And it really gave me pause because I have taught change management, leadership, and strategic planning and those kinds of things to our graduate students. But really to think about not just what kinds of best practices would be useful to share with those in our workforce today, but also how these concepts have been applied in my own professional experience. And really, for me, that's how I teach. Those are the things that I think can be very helpful in terms of either renewing this content that many of you might already know, or just thinking about it in a different context. How can we then bring these concepts to specific examples or applications in our work? So that's what I hope to bring to you today. A little bit of concepts, best practices, but also thinking about these concepts through different lenses, thinking about them through different case studies, so that I encourage you to also think about this in terms of how it applies or has applied in your both professional as well as personal experience. So as Val mentioned, I have a lot of hats, and this is the slide that I used to talk about my hats, just so you kind of know where I'm coming from in my background. I use this with my students. I call it the plate, right? We all have a plate that's usually overflowing with many different things. So just a little bit, Val covered most of it in the biography, that I am an associate professor with the University of Hawaii Manoa campus at both the Department of Psychiatry as well as Office of Public Health Studies. My major area of research is actually mental health and suicide prevention, also behavioral health, specifically violence and bullying prevention. And that really has been my passion area in terms of social behavioral work, in terms of policy, in terms of community advocacy, and thinking about how we can make changes at these larger levels that we'll be talking about today, our organizations as well as communities. As I'll mention later, I chair what is called the Prevent Suicide Hawaii Task Force. This is our statewide network for suicide prevention activities. And I'm also involved with other suicide prevention and mental health related organizations. And finally, I always like to tell people, we all have our families and our personal lives as well. So I always like a chance to show off my family because he's adorable. The boy, not the husband. But this is what kind of makes me the professional that I am. And this will actually color some of the examples and case studies that I've brought here today. So just briefly, what I'll be touching on today, like I mentioned, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of those basic concepts and frameworks. So of course, we know change is difficult or can be difficult. It doesn't have to be, but usually it's a process. It can pose some challenges. So we'll cover that right off the bat. And talk about then organizational DNA, as some in the field call it. What are those pieces of different organizations that may undergo change? Because not necessarily all of the pieces are undergoing change at the same time. Perhaps there's something specific within an organization that we might be focusing on. And then we'll briefly cover Kotter's 8-step process. Some of you might be familiar with that. I know organizations in Hawaii, different ones are actually using this right now to go through change processes. And then talking about strategies for managing change. Some of those change pitfalls, so to speak, that occur commonly. And then talk about why it is important in terms of, I guess, preempting those pitfalls in terms of looking at organizational readiness. And finally, how do we as leaders and managers address change when it comes our way? So these are just a couple of quotes that are my favorites that I've shared with my students over the years. Number one from, of course, our World Health Organization, that public health management demands particular skills, especially in respect of change management and leadership. But also my more favorite quote on change is that it's not the strongest that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And like we've heard many times, different people say that change is the only thing that we can always expect, that things are evolving, things will be changing. So let's be perfectly honest, change can be difficult. And of course, I always like to use my personal examples because as a mother and as a parent or as just somebody who is caring for a family, many of you know that change happens on a minute-to-minute basis in terms of our family lives. And of course, this is my son. His name is Dominic. He's 3, so he's still young enough for me to do this kind of thing. Later on, when he's like a high schooler, he'll be like, Mom, you can't do that without my consent or whatever, but now I can. And as many of you know, what is the biggest change that is occurring around those years, 2, 3, 4-ish years is, of course, potty training, right? He says, I'm bored. Mom says, too bad, you live here now. And so what are those change strategies? Because I really thought, well, I have different examples in my professional life, but what are those examples and how can I bring them forth in my personal life? So I thought about different change strategies that have been recommended to me by other parents, or many of you know, you go on those mommy blogs and there's tons of stuff on there that give you all kinds of advice on how to change this behavior, how to get your kid out of diapers and using the potty. So first they said, expose him to the potty, the flushing sound and all of that kind of stuff. Well, that's fine because now he likes to flush the toilet and waste the water. But how can that contribute to the behavior change? They said, well, read books about it and watch videos about using the potty. Try sitting. No, he's a boy. He needs to stand, all of those kinds of things. Well, buy him his own little potty. No, have him sit on the big potty. Use the thing that just goes on top of the big one so that he doesn't fall in. Okay. Keep toys near the potty so that it's fun, so he can play with things while he's sitting on there. And for those of you who have done this with young children, know they can sit there a long time if there are toys there. Like where mommy, it's like this, I'm bored, now we're all bored because we're sitting here for like 20 minutes. Then they said, buy him big kid underwear. Cool, did that, check. Wear the big kid underwear at home, so just in case there's accidents, you're at home at least and not in public. And then don't have him wear anything, have him run around naked, that kind of thing. Peer pressure, right? He goes to school, so are the other kids doing it? And of course, incentivize him, reward him. So all of these different strategies have been tried in our household. We'll get back to this story actually at the end of the presentation of how to motivate change, right? How do you motivate behavior change? And today we're going to talk about not really at this level of the individual, but how do you change the behavior or how do you change the culture of an entire organization or even a community? And those are some of the examples that I'd like to bring. So when I talk about things like change, organizational change, strategic planning, I always like to talk about leadership and management of these things on 2 sides. Number one, what I call the technical tools, right? Those are the tangible material skills that we need to give to our workforce and our students to be able to navigate. How do you create a strategic plan? How do you create an organizational change plan? How do you evaluate these things? So those are the real technical things that can come into play here. But there's also, as many of you know who are running organizations now, there's an art. There's also the artsy side of working with partners, communication skills and issues. How do you massage language? How do you communicate things in the most clear, transparent way? And really, this is just as important, if not more important to me in terms of organizational leadership and change is, well, we can teach people. We can teach people the skills and the skills and the tangible stuff. But if we don't have them practice, if we don't think about the application, then really some of those tools might be lost, because that art, the art of facilitation and interpersonal communication, really needs to come into play as well on kind of that flip side of the coin. So just a couple of ideas, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this or maybe are experiencing this yourself in your organizations now. There's a lot of reasons why change might be needed in terms of looking at the organizational level. On the internal level, there might be different internal shifts, correct? Some major changes in management or leadership, for example. Our organizations change structure all the time in terms of maybe an acquisition, maybe a merger, maybe other kinds of internal shifts. And also financial shifts, correct? Where your budget is going, where the priorities are going. If you're under a state or a federal funder, are there priorities shifting? Or maybe there's downsizing or those kinds of challenges going on. So a lot of different reasons. And then from the external side, and this often comes into play for us, for public health, is maybe there is a change in what we know. Maybe there's a change in terms of the quote unquote product, the public health issue. Maybe there's new research, maybe there's new technology that's available that requires us to make some kind of shift in strategy. Or there might be some kind of other change or shift in terms of our quote unquote competition, technology, social or other types of legal environmental issues. So in terms of general types of organizational change, and I'll just go through this quite briefly, there's a few that I've kind of culled from the literature and different disciplines, not just public health, but also some of the business literature, et cetera. The one that we think about most commonly is planned. There's some kind of deliberate plan or organizational change that is going to be made. Other times we may have experienced this personally is the emergent change. Something quote unquote spontaneous. There's a decision made, there's some kind of external factor or something that motivates the need to change. It might also be developmental. Organizations grow, they expand, they evolve, and those kinds of changes are things that might enhance or expand what we're doing right now. Transitional, as they say, is a goal to move from some kind of desired current to a desired state or practice, usually planned. And then finally, what they say is transformational, some kind of major shift in focus, assumption, values, or vision, some kind of even rebranding of an organization that might necessitate quite a large change process, usually a planned process. But again, let's be real, change can be uncomfortable. And one of my favorite reasons why I love teaching leadership and management is I get to go back to my Dilbert cartoons. And the manager saying what we need is an overarching strategy to stimulate our innovation. He says, or you could stop smothering the innovation we already have. And he says, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard in my life. And there it is. So lots of discomfort on thinking about things or even using different strategies. So lots of reasons, right, why even though we have the motivation, even though we have the skills, there still can be this human discomfort or organizational discomfort with shifting. So I would like to do for 1 minute something that I do with my students. We call this think, pair, share. So the game is to turn to number one, think in your own mind about this question. Why does organizational change stall, get delayed, or even fail? And I say share examples professionally, because sometimes when I have done this in the past, there's some venting that goes on because people like to talk about organizational failures that were not so good, if appropriate. But just, okay, so 30 seconds. If you can either think to yourself, and if you can access a neighbor or neighbors, to think, pair, and share. So what are some of the reasons why organizational change doesn't work or hasn't worked in your past experience? So 30 seconds and go. Okay, so how did folks do? I know you're not really used to your presenters asking you questions probably, but I am used to interactivity. So because we have kind of a big room and we have folks on Zoom too, I won't ask you to report out what you talked about, but there's a lot of reasons, correct? Oh, Val's coming with the microphone, so she's gonna help me make this interactive.
Sure.
So can we get maybe 3? Okay, there's like
And will you
very excited people.
Will the online people type in some comment? Camille will read them.
Okay. It could be possibly because there's no leadership with backbone that's willing to confront what's currently going on. Probably sees that there is a situation, but doesn't have the backbone or leadership to confront it or change it.
Sure. Thank you. So leadership is definitely one of those important ingredients. Others? Now it's coming.
The opposite of what you just said, where it's top down and employees aren't involved in making decisions regarding the change.
Thank you. So the opposite being that leadership is the only level of people that are bought in, and there's not that other buy-in. Come on, Jerry.
I think preparation helps, and letting employees know how these changes can benefit them and how it can benefit the organization, that helps the transition go smoothly.
Yeah, preparation, communication with employees.
Anybody else?
Right.
Yeah, Camille was sharing with me that she just finished working at St. Francis Hospice, and they were making a structural change, and the old timers were kind of pushing back because of just what you were saying. They didn't quite get included in the process, and so they had to deal with that pushback for a while, but then they got the change through. So yeah, it can really delay things.
Right. Great. Thank you. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of reasons, right? As human beings, we like our status quo. So we like to be comfortable. Once we get to our comfort place, it's hard to move us to doing things different. So well, how do we create that motivation? How do we create that sense of urgency, as they say, to say, well, this is why we're shifting or we're changing this one piece, and to try and get everybody on board. So some of the primary obstacles to change based on the research and stats that are out there, anybody want to guess what % of all change initiatives are actually not successful, according to Harvard? What was that? 80? So it's 70% of all change initiatives are not successful, unfortunately. And from the report that I got this from, they cited 3 primary reasons for organizational change, quote unquote, failure. Number 1 being insufficient communication, that, boy, people didn't even know that a change was going on, or what the rationale was, or what the urgency was behind the shift or the change. Number 2, as you mentioned, poor leadership support. That maybe leadership understands, but it's not being communicated and it's not being supported in terms of getting that employee buy-in. And then finally, a lack of a clear and compelling case for change. So maybe there's a plan, maybe things are happening, but people really don't understand the underpinnings of why the shift is being needed at this time. So these are kind of those 3 ingredients that we'll be focusing on today. And to expand on that, a lot of you talked about those reasons why specific individuals might feel hesitant. And again, those of you that have run an organization or spearheaded a community collaborative know that it might just be one individual, but if that individual is quite a strong individual with a lot of capital, then paying attention to the resistance of that one individual can actually save you a lot of headache as you're going through the change process. So it's important to identify these things and think about these individual reasons. So first, of course, people say, oh, this is going to be more work, or the change itself is going to cause more work, or to actually go through this change process is going to be more work for me, or I've done this before, maybe I've been burned by it before, and nothing came out of the change, so why should we do it again? Sometimes they're not aware of the reasons why change is necessary, like we discussed earlier. Some may not agree with the new direction or feel, hey, there's a better way to do that. There's a better way to get to the outcomes that we want. Or why are we doing this? There's like 10 more important things that we as an organization should be focusing on. And then sometimes change can create defensiveness, correct? Some people can feel there's an implied criticism about the way that things are being done. Hey, if you want to change something about my department, what are you saying? Are you saying my department is not performing? Are you saying that we're not doing things according to protocol, or we're not achieving our outcomes? So without that buy-in, without that process, this implied criticism, as you can imagine, can actually create quite a sense of resistance among employees. So now I want to dive into some of those more specific components or ingredients of organization that could undergo change. And this is an illustration from my doctoral students a couple semesters ago, where I asked them to envision what does a good organization look like. And at the middle, that really awesomely animated looking figure in the middle was their depiction of a perfect leader. So that was the leader being surrounded by a good supportive organization. So you can just see some of the things that they identified, but we'll go into more specifics with a couple of models that I'd like to share with you. The first framework, some of you might be familiar, is the McKinsey 7S framework. Again, to look at the individual components of an organization that may undergo change. So there's been a lot of research. I actually first was introduced to this framework when I first started in public health, and we used this framework for one of the organizations that I'm going to talk about in my case studies. We did a whole organizational assessment using this framework and this model. So the McKinsey framework, what it does is it splits the components of an organization into two categories. The first category, as they call hard elements. These are easier to define. They're more tangible elements. And they are things that can be more directly influenced by management and leadership. Number one being the structure. So the size, the complexity, how centralized or decentralized the organization is. Number two being the strategy. So what is our strategic plan? What are our actions, our timelines? How are we going to be planful, as well as how are we going to be responsive to, in anticipation of changes, to shifts in the external environment? And then number three, the systems. So what are those procedures or protocols that make our organization operate? On the bottom part of the figure, these are the things that are called the soft elements. More difficult to describe, a little bit more nebulous, and more influenced by the organizational culture overall. So number four being the style of the individuals, whether they be management, organizational culture, and especially if you're leading a very large organization, there can be subcultures within an organization. Number five, the staff. Those formal systems around how do we evaluate, how do we train, how do we build capacity, but also things like morale. How do we maintain, how do we improve employee morale? How do we motivate people to want to stay, come to the organization and stay and enjoy what they're doing? Number six being skills, so the skills of both the organization as a whole as well as individual team members. And then finally, those shared values, whatever those core guiding concepts are, those values, those aspirations, those visions that we as a group, as an organization, are striving to achieve. So here's another framework, a more recent one that I've been using with my students, the organizational DNA framework. And just similar to the McKinsey model, which is a little bit older, this one also categorizes things into formal and not informal. So on the left-hand side, you can see formal components being like standard operating procedures, what are the systems, metrics, reports, organizational charts, and those kinds of things. On the right-hand side, you can see the more informal things, the norms, organizational norms, mindsets, networks, how people connect, interpersonal relationships, and those kinds of components. Why I'm sharing this organizational DNA framework with you is it also considers what the organization then comes out to look like depending on what you're changing or the levels of different pieces within the organization. So how does everything fit together to create different types of organizations? So the first one, and again, in your own head, you probably can say, oh yeah, I've been in an organization that really was the culture. So the first being passive aggressive, as is called in this framework, that everybody agrees, but nothing ever really changes. And unfortunately, in my experience, I have worked at some of these organizations in Hawaii, especially because we don't like change, we don't like conflict, right? So everybody agrees and, oh, that's such a great idea, but then the change never actually really happens. So seemingly conflict-free builds consensus easily, but there's a struggle around implementation. The second type being overmanaged, kind of that micromanagement type of organization. And they say can even create what they say analysis paralysis, right? So many layers, so much bureaucracy, so much politics that there's not a lot of movement. It's not a very nimble type of organization. What they call number 3, the outgrown. Good old days meet a brave new world. So maybe an organization has now grown or expanded and is so complex that the old way of management, the old way of systems is not able to keep up with where the organization really needs to be. Number 4, fits and starts. So scores of smart, motivated, and talented people, but they may not be following a similar strategy, a direction, a strategic plan. And I actually have a colleague who works on the continent, and he managed a company like this for about a year. It was quite difficult actually for him in that he was a content expert, but not in all of his employees' fields. They were all very smart, very qualified, all doctoral level individuals, but they weren't united under one strategy. They weren't united under one vision, which is what he was tasked to do for that year. And he was able to kind of pull together a strategic plan. And how do you leverage, right, these very smart experts, but actually get them to move towards a similar goal, a similar vision? Number 5, the just in time, succeeding by the skin of our teeth. I'm sure some of us are familiar with this kind of organization. While inconsistently prepared for change, can be nimble, can turn on a dime, but without losing the sight of the big picture, the vision, the goals. Number 6, the military precision type of organization. And these exist even outside of the military. So what they say, flying in formation. Often with a small, very involved, very intensely grouped senior team, very well executed, and very efficient in terms of its operating model. And then finally, number 7, resilient, able to adapt quickly to external shifts, and always coherently moving towards a similar strategy. So now I'd like to shift gears and talk about a framework for the actual organizational change process. And this is where I'd like to introduce Cotter's 8-step process. And I've actually, even in the past few years, I've heard several other local speakers from different organizations talking about their change process and actually applying and adopting this model, which is why it's the one that I wanted to share with you guys today. So I'm going to talk through the actual classic 8-step process, but please know that the examples that I've heard locally even, there are different adaptations of these 8 steps and how each of these organizations, some were nonprofit, some were governmental, some were small organizations. So there's different iterations of this even locally, but we'll just talk through the 8 steps here. So the 8-step process, and again, I'm going to present this in this linear fashion, but of course we know that change isn't always perfect and linear. So just keep that in mind, but that's my caveat that I'm going to present this in this order. So the first step that they say is to create that sense of urgency. So that's that concept that we talked about earlier in terms of really not just addressing the resistance, not just having the plan, but the why. The big why, right? Every time we do a project, every time we start a new initiative, what is the why so that I can get behind that why? Because otherwise I have the tools, I have the strategy, but if I'm not really bought in from the beginning and I don't have that guiding principle, then it can lead to a lot of failures down the line. So creating that sense of urgency is really one of those initial steps. Help others see the need for the change. They even say have a bold, aspirational opportunity statement that everybody can get behind. Then number 2 is build your guiding coalition. Have that coalition help provide that guidance, that coordination, that communication. And I think for the most part, fortunately, that's why we are so lucky to work in public health and social service. We are used to working in teams and coalitions. I've seen others in, I think, less team-oriented disciplines where this is actually a difficult step. But for us, we would say, of course, we're going to do this big project, or we're going to take our organization through this process. Of course, we would assemble a team to do this as best as we can. Number 3, to have a strategic vision and have a strategic initiatives that go along with that vision, to form the strategic vision and articulate how all of these things are getting us towards that vision. How will this be different in the past? That's another piece that we talked about earlier in terms of addressing barriers, addressing resistance from employees. So especially the ones that have been around for many years. Yeah, we've done this, we've tried that, we've done those activities in the past. So how will this be different? Number 4, enlist a volunteer army. And there's different iterations of what people locally are calling their quote unquote army. But your group that is that bought-in group that has that drive to change and are moving in that same direction towards your strategic vision. Number 5 being to remove the barriers, to anticipate them and remove the barriers as much as possible, to really enable action, to really break down whatever we can foresee, to facilitate action as much as possible. We want to provide people with that freedom necessary to work across silos and really generate that true impact that we want out of this change process. We want to generate and we want to celebrate short-term wins. I've seen organizations where it's this big change process, like a big rebranding process, and you just have people falling off left and right after maybe 6 months because maybe there are short-term wins or there are things to celebrate, but they are not acknowledged, they are not celebrated. We are even guilty of this. We worked on a youth suicide prevention grant several years ago, and it took a very good friend and outside consultant to scold us and say, you guys have not celebrated anything in the past year since you have worked on this project. We said, oh, okay. So really to look at what are those short-term accomplishments. And I love this quote that is from Cotter, wins are the molecules of results. So show people what are these early wins, what are these early successes, and to celebrate them and say, hey, we know we're on the right track now. We know that we're actually making a difference here. Number 7, we want to sustain acceleration. We want to press harder after these early successes and not just, say, oh, great, we're awesome and we don't have to put any more energy into this. But really to say, yes, we want to press harder, we want to move forward. And of course, as a leader or manager of this organization or group, we know that credibility will build over time. So once we see that initial success, well, our credibility and the urgency will even snowball even greater after that. And then finally, we want to institute change as much as possible. We want to reinforce new behaviors, organizational behaviors. We want to articulate how they're contributing to that overall vision, constantly going back to that vision and that goal that we want to get towards, and institute and institutionalize things as much as possible. So here I'd like to introduce my first case study to kind of illustrate an adaptation of these different steps. And this is both the organizational as well as kind of a community change example. This is a project that I continue to work on, though when I first started at the Department of Psychiatry, this is the project that I worked on full time, was the Asian Pacific Islander Youth Violence Prevention Center. long name, long acronym. So we were known as the API Center in the community. And we were established in the year 2000 through CDC funding, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention funding, under the Academic Centers of Excellence for Youth Violence Prevention program, the ACEs program. And the program still exists today. Unfortunately, we don't have our big funding through CDC right now, though some of the work has sustained and continued, which is what I'll share today. And the program was actually started in 1999, after the Columbine shooting happened. This is when the ACE program started. So there were different academic centers established all over the country, and each center kind of had its niche or its specialization, so to speak. So ours, of course, was working with Asian Pacific Islander populations in terms of interpersonal youth violence prevention, and to look at things from a comprehensive public health, culturally competent lens. And these were our 6 aims. So I'll talk about these very briefly in terms of our activities, and then shift to let you know some of those internal organizational changes that helped us be more successful. So our charges were reduce and prevent youth violence, which is a very multifaceted issue. I think that's an understatement. And enhance the knits or the connectedness of the school community. And our focus, we were working in multiple communities with this grant, though one of our main focus areas was the Kailua Waimanalo area. So among all of our communities, our charges were to increase networking capacity, all of that excellent stuff. But specifically to our community-based activities, to do surveillance research, to look at what were people saying in our communities through household surveys and things like that, to hold togetherness meetings with communities, to create a venue to come together and talk about what are these issues and how can we create solutions for our communities, and then to help evaluate programs and bolster them from really excellent community programs to then having that evidence base to say, yes, these programs are actually making these great impacts. And then with our school-based activities, as I mentioned, our target area was Kailua Waimanalo, so we work primarily with Kailua High School. So a lot of research being done at the school, a lot of program evaluations, such as they have an ethnic studies course that we help to develop and evaluate. They're the first high school in the nation to make ethnic studies a requirement for all high school students to graduate from school. And also things like their PTPL course, Transition Plan and Leadership. There's a lot of other initiatives that we were able to assist with and help evaluate over time at the school. So this is a very busy slide, but I tried to summarize some of our actions, some of our successes, and a lot of lessons. There was a lot of lessons in terms of what we were doing and what we needed to change to actually be more successful. And I tried to categorize them kind of in the Cotter's steps categories. So the top row says urgency and vision. And really this was our first step back to say, we need to learn this lesson big and quickly. So on the right-hand side, there's a picture of plates and there's arrows. And this is a activity that we do in quite a few of our activities. The lesson was we weren't actually upstream enough. So we use this activity to say, hey, okay, community, you tell us, what are the issues and what's leading to these issues? What are causing these issues according to your perspective of being residents of this community? And of course, we were saying, well, of course, there's violence and there's substance use and et cetera, but what were the key issues? What were the upstream, the core issues? And we weren't hitting them in a lot of our programs. We were focusing on the downstream outcomes. And so they were telling us we weren't upstream enough. We weren't addressing exactly the right things. So once we were on the same page, activities actually flowed better. Once we shifted some of the strategies and activities, things flowed better with our community. The second piece, Coalition and Army, we had a lot of investment in partnerships. We had a lot of committees like these big grants do. But the lesson that we learned was that we were actually creating artificial silos with having all of these committees and the way that we were structuring them to meet with us, but not meet with each other. So we were actually creating silos among our partners where we said, hey, why don't we then have the different committees overlap? Why don't we have them talk with each other? Why can't a scientific or more academic researcher advise us on things outside of our science? Why can't they also look at our community projects? So those were some of the feedback that they were giving us. So we had to learn that lesson as well within the first year and say, okay, we need to restructure our communication, not just us to our external stakeholders, but how can they communicate amongst each other as well. The next category, barriers and celebrations. So that's one of the things that I really enjoyed and I carry with me even now as well, is frequent formal assessments and informal check-ins. I think our leadership did that very well. And really, how can we make sure everybody sees the big picture? Of course, there's different levels. It was a big organization. Not everybody is looking at that picture on a day-to-day basis, but how do we always bring people back to what is our goal? What is our mission of the center? What are the big things that we're trying to achieve? And so we were doing some of that, but over time, it got to be more purposeful, more frequent, that we were getting people to be brought in and refocused on the mission. And then finally, sustainability. We would institutionalize what we could. For example, the ethnic studies course. It started out as an after-school elective. It then became an in-school elective, and now it is a in-school requirement for that school. It's classified as a social studies course. So that's something, an example of a formal thing that we could institutionalize. But of course, realizing that sustainability and institutionalization of practices and programs was both formal and informal. That of course, we can put policies in place, we can put programs in place, but how can we maintain a practice and kind of informal practice within a community? And that was, I think, through the next thing that I wanted to talk about was organizational change and CBPR, or community-based participatory research. And putting together these slides, I had my aha, which I then asked myself, is this why? Is this one of the ingredients of why we could make impact and why we could make the change that we did? Is that the ACEs, the Academic Centers for Excellence, all worked through this lens, the CBPR lens. So I think all of us are familiar with what CBPR, so the basic definition of is there. And I think we are all familiar with the different principles, the 9 principles of CBPR. And just as we look at these, we can think about the parallel between these and the core principles and best practices of organizational change. Getting buy-in, looking at the unit of identity being not the individual people, but the community, the group, making sure there's mutual benefit, making sure there's relevance, making sure that everything is a shared responsibility. So I had this aha moment to say, hey, when we're looking at both organizational and community change, there's so many parallels, there's so many overlaps with the best practices that we've been talking about. So if we can apply this lens to an organizational change or community change process, which is actually what we were doing, but not calling it organizational change, that this, I think, is one of those key ingredients of why API Center was able to make the changes that it did. So here's just some examples of sustained change that are still going on today. These are both community as well as school community projects. So ethnic studies, I mentioned, God's Country Waimanalo, which one of our colleagues, Jane Chung-do, works with, doing aquaponics in Waimanalo. And several M&M Night, Jumpstart Day, and there's other programs still going on in the school. And actually there's still research going on there with several teachers who have gone on to get their doctorates, who now are coming back as researchers to keep the program evaluation and organizational change concepts going. So just to leave off some of that case study that changed through a CBPR lens, some of, again, those summaries or lessons learned when we look at our center strategies through that CBPR lens. Our center overall, we had a very good presence in the community. We knew people on a personal basis. And we made sure to have that investment, that give back for training, dissemination, as well as give back to the community. And then our larger network, that engagement and that buy-in from all levels was very important. And we were all partners, no matter what your position was, no matter what your role was, no matter what your educational background was. We were all partners, we're all learning, we're all forging the path together through to this vision of change that we had. And we all were open to being wrong and exploring then what needs to change. What is the better route? What is the better way to do things? And again, so much parallel between CBPR principles and organizational community change principles. And I think these boil down to kind of those ingredients that helped us to be successful. All right, so shifting gears a little bit. Sorry, I had to throw in another Dilbert cartoon. So now we have the tools and strategies. Why is change still uncomfortable? If we know what to do, why are things still failing? So here the boss says, we're hiring a director of change management to help employees embrace strategic changes. And Dilbert says, or we could come up with strategies that actually make sense. Then employees would embrace change. And the boss says, that sounds harder. So we know that, of course, change can be uncomfortable for both employees as well as managers and leaders. So let's talk a little bit what I mentioned earlier about some common change pitfalls. And I tried to categorize these again according to the Cotter steps. But these are some things just based on reviewing other case studies and literature that I found to be the most common change pitfalls. The first category being relating to timing or possible what they call analysis paralysis, right? The people or organizations become paralyzed by risk or tough decisions, or like I mentioned earlier, no short-term outcomes seen, or if they are occurring, they're not acknowledged. So some potential strategies to address these pitfalls, or even better yet, to anticipate them in advance. Again, that first step of the Cotter's 8 steps, create that urgency, create the big why, and communicate it as clearly as possible to both your internal and external stakeholders. And celebrate short-term wins. You don't have to wait until all the steps are done and all the changes are done and the organization completely flips over, but we can celebrate along the way. And we can reward those who are contributing and helping with that change process. This next category is relating to vision and purpose for change more specifically. And like we mentioned earlier, there might be no vision. Leadership might not have a clear vision or the outcomes of change. The reasons are vague or they're complicated. Again, the communication issue, or the change might not be consistent with the actual core values or shared values of the organization. So a few potential strategies to address these potential pitfalls. Again, to have and convey a vision with consistency. And I added with consistency because I read a few case stories where there was a vision, but it wasn't communicated consistently. It was interpreted in different ways by different managers, and that created some miscommunication among different departments. So making sure everybody, you might have the vision, but what is the interpretation? How are we conveying it? And then having that communication plan for both internal as well as external stakeholders. The next category is relating to what I call the change team. So in Cotter, he calls it, there's the coalition as well as the larger army, so to speak. So a lot of times especially in larger companies, we tend to see the change planning or change management process relegated to only people at the top. And as was mentioned earlier, only senior leadership or management really knows what's going on or sees the big picture. Also, those in those positions, those key positions aren't bought in, or they don't personify the change or the change process, and they don't believe in it. So some potential strategies here, of course, using that powerful guiding coalition that Cotter talks about, where there is that shared commitment. It is more a sense of teamwork as opposed to that top-down kind of strategy. And also thinking about diversity. And I added this one in, and of course, again, in our local public health and social service sector, I think we embody diversity. It's such a second nature thing for us. But because sometimes it is so second nature, we might not think about it, right? So when you're assembling these types of coalitions, or even going through these change processes, thinking about what is the team that I've assembled, what does it look like in terms of different aspects of diversity, not just levels of management or where you are in the hierarchy kind of thing, but other things to think about, men and women, age groups, representing different departments, representing different islands or areas of our community, especially if you're working on a statewide project. All of those things contribute to the diversity of your coalition. And also empowering people, right? And actually, this is a big reason why I enjoy policy so much. Not thinking about policy in terms of what you can't do, but using policy and processes and systems to empower people and say, well, this is what you can do. This is what we can do to help create this change or to make this happen. And to really, again, celebrate, hire, promote, develop those who can contribute and implement the change in a positive way. The next category being change resistance. And one of the next examples I'll give you addresses this. Really underestimating the difficulty of getting people out of their comfort zone. And that's something that I have heard from many leaders that I've talked to, is how do you get people to buy in and really get on board to something that we're not all totally sure about, and it's not in our comfort zone, but how do you get people to jump on board to the process, especially, as I said earlier, those with strong influence or strong social capital at the organization, because you guys know one negative person can unfortunately be the downfall for some of these change processes. So strategies: identify and address early on, if possible, those key players who may resist the change effort, and encourage that space for innovative thinking, non-traditional thinking, different ideas, different ways, and not just say it. I've had leaders say, yes, we're very open to this, like bring all your ideas here. But then for those initial brave ones who actually spoke up and said something, their ideas weren't taken seriously, unfortunately. So really creating that space, but really what is the process then to process through and acknowledge and see, validate some of these new ideas. And the last category relating to sustainability, sometimes the change plan occurs, but it's not fully implemented, or it's not sustained over time. Of course, that's a really difficult one. So some potential strategies: we institutionalize what we can, right? We codify what we can in terms of new approaches or policies, create systems, look at communication plans, all of these things, training plans, succession plans, et cetera, to try and institutionalize things as much as possible. So planning, and I think somebody mentioned this in terms of one of our best tools that we have to help to preempt those pitfalls is to have as best as possible a plan that is as comprehensive as possible. So as you plan or cover your bases, so to speak, I encourage you to think comprehensively when going through these kinds of change management processes. So think about who will be involved, who will the changes affect, not just who's going to plan this, but what are those downstream effects, trying to minimize being blindsided later on of unintended consequences of these changes that we're looking at. What are we changing? What are we changing? Are we changing the whole organization? Are we changing a specific component? Can it be changed? What cannot be changed? What are our non-negotiables? And this is a lesson that I had to learn coming up through the ranks of management, is letting employees know what is non-negotiable. These are the things that we are open to, but these are also the things that unfortunately we must abide by according to our funders or our contract. So that's why they are non-negotiable, not just because I like to do them that way, but these are the parameters. But otherwise, we have space for creative thinking around everything else. And what are the consequences if we don't make this change? Are they just small consequences, or are they actually dire consequences? And other things like why? What is the purpose? Is there a deadline? Do we have to make all of these changes or improvements by a certain date? And then how will everything take place? And then, of course, keeping in mind things like communication with stakeholders is important. And then this leads me into talking about understanding an organization or community's readiness for change. So why do we talk about readiness, and what exactly is organizational readiness? So it's just some general concepts for those who might not be familiar. The concept of readiness at the organizational level or group level is that shared commitment, shared resolve for whatever the collective action or change is. And just like an individual, for those of my social workers or public health nerds, no trans-theoretical model, right? That is the stage of change, behavior change model. To say that we as people, we don't just change all of a sudden, but we have to be ready to do it. And it's not just the same type of ready for everybody. There are different stages of readiness. Am I kind of sort of ready? Am I even ready to listen to you? Or am I ready for action already? Am I at that point where I'm really ready to change what I'm doing, change my behavior? And in the same way, organizations and communities can have those different levels of readiness. So it can be applied in various contexts as any part of any change assessment process. It can be introducing something new, or it can be readiness for change. And these different models have been applied in many different settings, and we've used some of them here in Hawaii, which are the ones that I'll talk about. So why is this so important in change management? The research shows that it is a precursor to successful implementation of changes. Not just what are we ready, but what are we ready for? And really to match the program, intervention, or change to the level of readiness of the organization. So we want it to be challenging enough to be able to motivate and move people forward. But of course, if people are not at that high level of readiness, we don't want to be too ambitious where they are not able to respond, or where they just shut down from the get-go. And we want to make sure to leverage potential assets, and through this process, identify those assets as well as potential barriers. And then that piece of empowerment can come about through this readiness assessment process, especially when changes are forced. And we have all been there. We've all been in that company or organization where, we've got to do this because something external is making us change our strategy or change the way that we approach things. So especially this process of not just creating the change steps or process, but also looking at readiness and assessing people up front can help to create that buy-in, that engagement and empowerment. So a couple of tools that are out there in terms of assessing community organizational readiness. The first that I'm presenting here is one that we have used locally, the community readiness model. This actually comes out of Colorado State University. It started out, I believe, in HIV/AIDS prevention, but it's now been applied, lots of literature and research on it, in substance use, violence prevention, injury prevention, suicide prevention, even environmental issues. And around the circle, you can see are the different stages of readiness. So starting at 1 being no awareness, all the way up to 9 where there's high level of ownership. So there are different processes in this guide and this model to actually help assess the initial phase, where is your organization or community at, and how to move the organization up to fully ready or high level of ownership. The second tool that I'll just mention is Communities That Care. This one comes out of University of Washington. The next case study that I'll talk about, we actually adapted this for use with our local healthcare population. And it moves readiness in these 5 steps, I guess. So get started, get organized, develop your profile plan, and then implement. And it actually comes with this milestones and benchmarks tool. So it's almost a checklist, so to speak, of how to assess and then how to move an organization or a community from one level to the next level. So with that, I'll move into my second case study, our Youth Suicide Prevention Project, the Hawaii's Caring Communities Initiative. And this one, this was a 3-year federal grant from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to do specifically youth suicide prevention. This is through their Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act program, GLS program, which was put into place by Senator Gordon Smith former Senator Gordon Smith of Oregon, who lost his son, Garrett, to suicide. And so we were blessed to have a statewide grant to do youth suicide prevention for 3 years to build on our existing efforts within the state. We were tasked with focusing on youth who may be at higher risk for suicide, and in the case for Hawaii, as is in actually many other places, especially our rural areas and our Native Hawaiian and Indigenous populations. And also to look at broader systems issues, our safety net for these youth, by working with organizations as well as healthcare providers. So the way that the grant was designed was to address all 3 levels of prevention. So many of you know and have memorized this and learned this very nicely in your courses, primary, secondary, tertiary prevention. So we had 2 projects that were designed around these 3 levels. The first being one that was very much upstream, working directly with youth to do community and youth-based suicide prevention projects. And the second project, which is the one that I was the director for, was working at the organizational level, looking at emergency rooms, trauma centers, clinics, mental health centers, and looking at their organizational capacity for working with youth suicide prevention. So this was our project plan, basically to partner with as many people that would not shut the door in our face, for partnering with different hospitals, emergency departments across the state. We're using an evidence-based training program called Connect, Suicide Prevention Training, and using our train the trainer model that many of us use in the community to train people at the sites as well as in the community to train others. And then also look at organizational change, looking at changing policies, protocols, how do you screen people, how do you refer people after working with, so increasing that capacity to work with suicidal youth and their families. So we had a lot of challenges, and this led us then down and talk about readiness. So as you can imagine, jumping into kind of the organizational realm of healthcare, and how do you create organizational change in a healthcare setting? A lot of the models had been, as you can see, had been initially developed and tested in the broader community sense. So it was quite a challenge, and that intersection of cultures, as this first category is called, of how to then take these tools and take these concepts and adapt them and apply them within a kind of healthcare setting, and almost because our healthcare is kind of a market setting, right? So how do we apply these things in this more market-based setting? So these were some of the early challenges that then led us to think about readiness. So a lot of these intersection of cultures, individual versus group, healthcare versus the larger community, getting started, getting organized, getting action, getting change going in these different organizations. We were very blessed to have a lot of champions, but as many of you know, champions are often overworked because they are awesome and they say yes to everything. So how could we kind of look at that from a broader perspective and say, okay, how do we expand that network of champions? Moving upstream in prevention. One of the first meetings I went to at a ER was that we don't do prevention here. We don't do prevention in ERs. So some of that educational process to say, yes, you do. You just do prevention in a different way as opposed to a more primary prevention program. And other things that you can see, like assessing protocols, looking at other bigger systems, how do we address commitment, how do we address staff turnover. So after the first few months and assessing all of these challenges, we said, well, let's take a step back. We need to use the community tools for readiness assessment, and we need to do them here. We skipped over them because we thought, yeah, we can do them in the community, but we didn't apply them to the organizational setting. So we went through all these processes, readiness assessment with our sites. This is just an example to show you what it looked like to just sit down and go through these processes with our sites. And we were able to actually engage the stakeholders better. We're able to engage people, not just the frontline folks, but also the leadership. And we're also able to engage people across sites to say, hey, what are those barriers or challenges that we're anticipating here? How does it apply to other sites? How does it apply to other systems? So we're able to connect people in that way as well. And from that, we published this model of organizational readiness in the healthcare system, specifically for suicide prevention, to say communities and people, individual people, are not the only entities that we need to think about readiness for when we're thinking about change. We need to actually do this for organizations as well. We need to garner that relationships at multiple levels, not just the high leaders, not just the frontline people, but from all levels. We want to look at an inventory of resources from all levels, from individuals to programs to policies. We want to look at a purposeful process to do all of this. We want to look at sustainability from the get-go. It's not a year 5 of the grant thing to think about. It's a year 1 thing to think about in terms of sustainability. And then all of that centers around this important piece of addressing readiness before we go in and we ask people, hey, now what do you want to change? Now, how do we improve this? So that was our lesson, well, my lesson as, hey, now you're the director of this project. That was my lesson to say, okay, we need to take a step back and do this process first before we go in and we ask administration and employees to take a leap of faith with us, right? And to make the changes that we were asking them to make. So finally, where does that leave us? As for us as leaders, as managers in our communities, in our organizations. So I'm gonna leave you with a few competencies that are recommended for successfully leading change. And a final, my own personal case study that Val mentioned. So number 1, do your best to embrace the change, right? If you as the leader don't believe in it, nobody's gonna believe in it. And people can call it, right? They can call it if you don't believe in it. So embrace the change, try to be that change agent. Make sure that it's a process, right? It's not just leader makes a decision and oh my gosh, magic happens overnight and the change is made. It is a process. Use a structured process that allows for that engagement and buy-in. Address support and resistance upfront as much as possible. Frequent communication to really weed out any underlying resistance or any underlying criticisms as early as possible to be able to address them. We want to frame change management to make the organization innovative. We want to reframe it from a negative thing to actually say, hey, you know, we're being innovative, we're changing to be on the cutting edge. We also want to say, what else do we want to get out of this change process? What else can we get out of it? So some organizations, one that I'm working with right now, you know, we've got to do this, we've got to make these changes or these updates, but what else can we get out of the process? Well, what do staff want to learn? Do they want to learn like how to actually do these steps? Do they want to learn new skills through this process? By all means, let's make this something positive. So even though we have to do the required things, we can actually help staff gain some competencies that they've been wanting to learn. And then finally, when recruiting staff and knowing that change is inevitable, things are going to continue to evolve, look at succession planning. Keep change management in mind while you're doing succession planning, and look at characteristics such as innovative, creative thinking when you're recruiting in your succession planning. Because there's a lot, right? There's a lot of things that precede the actual change. You need to show people. You need to address emotions. You want to reduce emotions that can undermine the change that you want to make. And before you even get to the right-hand part of the figure, that is the actual change. So there's a lot of this groundwork to be done before implementing the actual change you're wanting to make. So finally, I'm going to end with my final case study. I added this in because I'm still learning. I'm still learning about organizational management and change. So this is Janelle's crash course in leading change. And some of my colleagues are in this room, so they're gonna laugh. So as I mentioned, I'm currently the statewide chair for the Prevent Suicide Hawaii Task Force. It's not something that I am paid for. It's something that we all come to the table to do voluntarily. And it's something that I've grown to be my passion for the most part of my day. It's my passion. Some days it's not, but actually I gained this role several years ago, kind of on surprise, when the person before me could no longer fulfill the role. So with surprise, you're a new leader. Okay, awesome. And then as I'm coming in to take over, I'm kind of like, so what are we doing? What are we supposed to doing? There's no plan. There's no plan. Okay, there's no strategy. Okay, very powerful statewide collaborative, but at the time, I mean, we're still a grassroots organization, but as a leader and trying to create strategy, not too much for me to work on. So over time, we have slowly been moving towards a more formal plan, a more formal sense of direction as an organization. And over time, of course, people are like, well, we need to get on the map. We need to talk to policymakers. We need to do these things, go down to the Capitol and all of this kind of stuff, which was fabulous, but we weren't quite there as an organization when I became chair. So again, that was another kind of ongoing change process to get us to the point where we had enough infrastructure to get to the point where we were talking to legislators. And then finally, after talking to legislators, they said, great job, task force. Now create a strategic plan for the state for youth suicide prevention. Then of course, I had a freak out moment. So how do we do that? And how do we go from our surprise to like, here's kind of what we're doing, but we don't really have a formal plan, to now we want you guys to have a formal plan and a process. So as I mentioned, this is us. I always like to brag, the kids are always fabulous of who we are. We're statewide, we're formally convened in 2001, et cetera, and these are the things that we do. And this is kind of our history of speaking with our lawmakers so that you kind of know where the strategic plan idea came out of. We have done several informational briefings over the years. And several years ago, a concurrent resolution was passed that was a surprise to us. Department of Health called me and said, hey, did you see this? They want the Prevent Suicide Hawaii Task Force to create a strategic plan to reduce suicides in Hawaii by at least 25% by 2025. So that was my freak out moment. Actually, myself and many of our other coalition members, there was kind of an email frenzy for the next hour after that. So then it was like, okay, well, how do I try to lead our task force through this process that we had never really taken on before? So of course I said, well, we need an army, right? We need a subcommittee. We need people who are going to come together to be able to do this. So we formed our little army. We tried our best to gain input and buy-in as much as possible from different stakeholders. And it was a process. We met for over a year to just be able to put the best product forward, because we had never before put this kind of product together for the legislature. And we said, well, we need a guiding vision. We need a place to start. So this was our place to start. Plates and arrows. We go back to basics. And along the way, there was resistance. There's a bullet up there that says address resistance. And there are several stories, which I won't bore you with today. But actually, several of the early resistors through early intervention, I guess, actually became the strongest supporters at the end of the process. So that was quite an experience to be able to convince people of the vision and to address the resistance and get them to be supporters. So we actually went from kind of a framework there, as one of my colleagues drew on a napkin during a meeting, to a formal framework that we put together for the legislature with a formal strategic plan. So it took over almost 2 years, which we reported back to the legislature last December. And now, of course, the battle is implementation. But we were finally on the map to say, hey, we're here, we've got this plan, we're a little bit more formalized, and that's my personal ongoing process to leading through change, leading through these different iterations of formality of the task force. So what happened with Dominic? I think I'm getting to the end. Sorry, Val. So what happened? Yeah, we had that vision, right? We had a vision, you will fully be potty trained, blah, blah, blah. We tried different strategies. We definitely have a team. He goes to preschool, and he goes to a very nice preschool where they help us. So he's not 100% there, but he's almost there. So we celebrate the short-term wins, and we're trying to get to that maintenance of sustainability. I love this. I used to be cool and do things. Now I argue with a smaller version of myself about how to use the toilet. So that's where we are. Changing behavior. He's almost there. The deal is once he fully is actually potty trained, he can have a fish, like with a tank and everything. So but we're not there yet, but I'll let you know when we're there. So some parting thoughts. It's iterative and rarely linear, and it's never 100 complete. Make sure to look upstream for those root causes. Champions are essential. They're also diverse. Not every champion is going to serve the same role. And find ways to sustain yourself. So this is my way to part with self-care. So my mental health colleagues in the room will know this, but as leaders, even as people who are motivating change in the community, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. So we must ABC our self-care, have awareness, have that balance, take time for relaxation and reflection, and of course, honor your connections, have connections, make connections, as many as possible, and diverse connections, right? Not every connection you have will serve the same purpose. So you might have a colleague for this, you might have a colleague for that, your family serves another purpose, your friends serve another purpose. So make those connections. And the bottom line, take care of yourself, right? These are webs. We always say web of support. Who is your web of support? Take care of yourself. Self-care. The literature says 5 minutes a day minimum, whatever that is to you. And even our youth that we work with, they make self-care kits with small things that invigorate, inspire, or relax you. Whatever it is that you need to do to sustain you so that you can sustain the movement and the change, right? And that's it. Okay, sorry, Val, questions?
Oh my gosh, that was fabulous, Janelle. Thank you. And I have a couple, but there is one online that I'll read from Lenny. Now, oh gosh, it just moved up. Now that, also, how can senior leaders, I think they mean senior management leaders, promote change in workplace with low morale? Mm-hmm. That's the question. And Lenny had this comment where, how can the staff buy into any change if their leaders seem to be ineffective and not available during key hours, or if they're only present in body and not in mind? It seems easy, senior leaders, to communicate change but lack the motivation in their tone, demeanor. I guess change is hard for all, even the ones that are trying to initiate the change. Mm-hmm. So there seems to be a morale. And you've given wonderful examples. I particularly like the readiness and reframing it into innovation. So Lenny wrote this before you got to those slides. Do you have anything else to add?
I think for me, of course, morale is always a difficult thing. That doesn't have to be a difficult thing, but it can be. I think in terms of engaging people in the conversation, in the process. And so many times, I mean, I have been fortunate to grow up in an organization where we were always involved, ad nauseum almost. But we always knew we could engage in the conversation and in the decision making. And the transparency of what can change and what cannot change. So that was modeled for me. I model it now. And of course, it's best practices in the literature to say, well, this is why, these are the reasons. And even if some of the reasons are confidential, to say that. These are the things I can tell you, but there's some other things that are confidential, or maybe your boss's boss doesn't even know, or whatever. But to have that transparency to say, this is what I can tell you, this is what I cannot tell you. Here's the parameters, but to ensure that transparent communication and to have that engagement process, to have that buy-in, even if something is difficult or it's an undesirable change, to engage people as much as possible, to at least process, get those initial resistances out ahead of time, in my experience.
That's a great answer, the transparency, a good answer. Another participant, thank you for your presentation. A few questions for case study number 1. What were the matrix that helped to assess if the project is being upstream enough? How did these culturally appropriate matrix come about?
Mm-hmm. In terms of I think they're referring to the matrix where I talked about not being upstream in the kind of plates and arrows exercise. I mean, it wasn't really a realization when we went into the grant to say, oh, well, we're already not upstream enough. It was more of a framing of, we all know, this is what we wrote in the grant. This is what we said our long-term outcomes would be. So the first step is ask the community, right? Ask the community. This is what we propose. These are the activities that we propose. And of course, we had gotten support, early buy-in before we even submitted the grant. But now to say, okay, now that we have the funding, excellent. So is that still correct? Are those still the things that we want to be working on? And so with that CBPR lens, which I think is so powerful when you're thinking about organizational or community change, to say, well, we better ask. We better ask before we even jump in or do anything, even though we came in with a plan that was fabulous and I guess the reviewers liked it. But to go back to the community and to make sure, are we addressing the things that they want to be addressing? So to make sure that we were always checking ourselves against what the community was saying, where they were at their readiness level. And that's the other thing about readiness assessment. It's not really a one-time thing and you're done. It's a constant process to say, okay, we're doing this, we're addressing readiness level, we're trying to get to the next level, but to do ongoing assessments to make sure you have that temperature along the way.
Well, and that's the beauty of a group working together. We evolve together and then the readiness changes. So like you said, it has to be an ongoing reassessment of the group's readiness besides your own readiness. Mm-hmm. Another question, which groups, organizations, suicide hotlines, example, Access did the Prevention Suicide Task Force partner with?
All of the above.
Okay. Yeah, and I think she might have not looked at your last slide that had all those, or I guess they're right here. Did you plan a curriculum for children in the school to learn about adult hotlines, groups, resources for their mental health? I guess it's a curriculum for children and help the, I don't know what they mean by adults, their parents, the resources.
Yeah, we actually, and you can invite this person to contact me for more information.
Okay.
We have a lot of different partners doing different things, including some of whom are sitting here that are working in the schools. There are different trainings and curricula that we've been using to promote awareness.
And then thank you for your great presentation. I think we all feel that way. There's a couple other comments, but we've sort of run out of time. And I just feel the thoroughness of your case examples and then your own third case example made this a very rich and very precise and unique presentation, especially now that you're the statewide leader of the task force. So I really want to thank you, Janelle, for being here. And I want to remind everybody to fill out the evaluation. Camille will be emailing you, and to remind anyone who's nearby Queens that we're going to have a little aloha hour afterwards for Camille and myself, and please, you're welcome to stay and talk to us and have a snack, but I think we should sign off. Thank you. Let's thank Janelle.